Welcome Year 7 to the Meanwhile Elsewhere. Here we take a wider look at the historical world in topics that link or maybe show us a bit more about what we're looking about in the class, perhaps from a different angle. So at the moment we're looking at England in the medieval period in the classroom. So meanwhile elsewhere, something known as the Islamic world would enter its golden age. You've probably heard about Islam before in RE, and it was still an important religion in the medieval period. If you look at your map on your Meanwhile Elsewhere homework slips, you can see the part of the world that was dominated by Muslim kingdoms at this time. And I'm hoping over the course of this, you can complete all the tasks and maybe think about why I picked this for us to look at whilst we looked at medieval England in the classroom. Our first task is going to be looking at these 4 questions in task 1. So whilst I'm taking you through the next few slides of this presentation, I want you to think about answering those 4 questions. Now when you think of medieval England, you're probably thinking of images like this. On the left hand side you've got the standard medieval English village where around 90% of typical peasants lived at this period of time. You know, they've got the strip farming, the churches, huts, and maybe a manor's house. And on the right hand side, you've got a typical medieval English castle in the Tower of London here, situated in medieval London, medieval England's foremost city. However, the medieval Islamic world was very different to this. So to introduce ourselves to the medieval Islamic world, we have to go to the centre of it. And that centre was Baghdad. Now some of you may already be aware of Baghdad. It's a major city in Iraq. Some of you may have even had family that worked there, fought there during the Iraq War. But in the medieval period, Baghdad was often known as the centre of the world. You can see in this illustration, it's a highly packed, densely populated city. And this is because it had a population of around 1 million at this point in time, which means it is by far and away one of the largest cities in the world, only really being competed by with cities in medieval China. So a pretty large city at this time. But it's not just medieval Baghdad. Across medieval Arabia are cities like this in the illustration below. Once again, incredibly populous, highly developed, a lot of trade travelling through. This is the sort of idea we're looking at with a medieval Islamic world. And here, just to crown the idea of what a medieval Islamic city looked like, below you have medieval Damascus. The oldest city in the world, or the oldest inhabited city in the world. It was just as densely packed and vibrant as those 2 other cities I showed you. And this meant that the medieval Islamic world was highly populous and highly urbanized. But what is that going to mean for the people who live there? Well, if you look at the map here, which is also on your Meanwhile Elsewhere homework slips, you can see the extent of the medieval Muslim world. Stretching down in Southeast Asia to India and Indonesia, into Africa and Zanzibar and then along the Sahara, up to Spain in the west and even in Russia in the north. And this meant that people living in the medieval Islamic world could experience a wide variety of different trade goods. They'd be getting furs brought in from the north, silk brought in from China, ivory from elephant tusks from Africa. People in the medieval Islamic world had access to all sorts of goods, and people in medieval England just did not. And this also meant that the trade passed through along where these blue arrows are, from China and India onto something known as the Silk Road. This Silk Road went through the medieval Muslim world, out into places like Africa, but importantly to us, up into Europe and eventually England. This meant medieval Islamic world was almost like a bridge between medieval Europe and other places around the world, and it meant that people were constantly travelling back and forward through the medieval Islamic world, bringing trade goods, knowledge, but also in some cases diseases, which we'll look at later on in the year when we come to the Black Death. This meant cities like medieval Baghdad were incredibly vibrant locations with all sorts of different traders, trade goods, animals from all over the known world passing through here. So I know right now you're probably thinking, just because the place is densely packed, highly populated, doesn't mean that it's worth learning about, doesn't mean that it has a higher living value than medieval England at this point in time. So to counter that, I'd show you something known as the House of Wisdom. Here, in the centre of that illustration of Baghdad I showed you earlier on, highlighted in a yellow circle, is what's known as the House of Wisdom. And in the House of Wisdom were teachers, students, and books from all corners of the known world. This meant that in the House of Wisdom, there were all sorts of learning going on, subjects like maths, architecture, science, algebra, which you may be familiar with, and medicine were being studied in the House of Wisdom. One of the most critical to us being medicine, the study of medicine. And this meant around the Muslim Empire were oftentimes buildings like hospitals with almost trained medical professionals who could diagnose and treat all sorts of illnesses. And this meant that if you lived in the medieval Muslim Empire, not only did you have access to all sorts of amazing trade goods, you also had access to completely innovative medicines. And not just that, some incredibly developed inventions. Here's one in particular. This is something known as an astrolabe. And these would have been developed in the House of Wisdom. And they were used to help navigate the days and the times of the month, in a time when they didn't have clocks and watches. And it also allowed sailors to be able to see where they were when they were travelling on a boat at night time, based on the stars in the sky. So based on all the information I've just told you there, I hope you feel equipped enough to answer those 4 questions on the importance of the medieval Islamic world in task 4. So it might be worthwhile now maybe even pausing me and rewinding the video to help you with that, or if you're feeling confident enough, have a crack at all 4 right now. Now the second task is something a little bit different. You have 3 sources below, and what you need to do is match them to what they tell us about the medieval Islamic world. Do they tell us about everyday life, power, connections, or medicine? Now, source A I've already done. Source A clearly matches up to everyday life, connections, and medicine. Now what I'd like you to do is to think about source B and C, in which categories they can potentially match up with. If it helps, pause me now. Thirdly, use those sources to say what they tell us about the medieval Islamic world. You've even got a sentence starter there to help you. It says the sources tell us that the Islamic world in the medieval period was, and pick a descriptive term there, then expand by saying this is shown by the fact that, and say what from the sources tells you that. Once again, pause me now if you want to have a crack at task 3. Finally, you have the story of an individual here, the story of Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was an explorer from medieval Morocco, and he took advantage of how connected the medieval Islamic world was. Now, using his story, you got 2 paragraphs here, so reading through those, could you answer the 2 questions about Ibn Battuta to finish off your work on the Meanwhile Elsewhere, focused on the Islamic world? If you want, you can pause me now, and when you're done, finish off a sheet and get it handed in to me at school. Thank you.